My daughter woke me before sunrise and stood at my bedroom door. I knew something was wrong the moment I opened my eyes. The house was still dark, the kind of dark that belongs to night, not morning. And yet she was standing there, fully dressed, arms folded, her shadow stretched long across the hallway floor. She didn't knock loudly. She didn't rush. She waited. That morning, she looked at me and said 5 words I was never meant to hear. She said it calmly, like she had already made her choice. Her voice didn't shake. Her face didn't soften. There was no hesitation. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I just realized our relationship had ended forever. At that exact moment, something inside me went still. Not angry, not shocked, just quiet. The kind of quiet you feel when you finally understand that a door has closed and no amount of love will ever open it again. She didn't stay to explain. She didn't wait for a response. She turned and walked back down the hallway as if she had only reminded me to pay a bill or lock the door. And I lay there in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to her footsteps fade, knowing that whatever those 5 words were, they had carried more weight than everything else she had ever said to me. But to understand why that moment mattered so much, why it didn't just hurt, but ended something, you need to know who I was before that morning, because I wasn't fragile, I wasn't helpless, and I wasn't a woman who frightened easily. Before that day, my life was simple, quiet, but earned. I woke up when the sun came through the curtains, not before. I drank my tea slowly. I talked to my plants like old friends. This house wasn't grand, but it was mine. Every mark on the wall had a memory. Every drawer held a piece of a life lived carefully. I had raised my daughter here. I had nursed her fevers in the same bedroom she now stood in. I had waited up nights listening for her footsteps when she was late. I had defended her when people told me she was selfish, impatient, too sharp with her words. She's strong, I used to say. She knows what she wants. I never imagined one day I would be on the other side of that strength. After her father passed, it was just the 2 of us. I worked longer hours. I made choices that were practical, not joyful. I told myself that love meant endurance, and when she grew older, built her own life, moved on, I told myself that distance was normal. We spoke often enough. We laughed on the phone. She called when she needed advice. I thought we were still connected. I didn't know I had slowly become something else to her. Not a mother, a resource. The change didn't arrive with shouting or insults. It arrived quietly, disguised as a visit. One afternoon, she called and said she needed to stay for a little while, just until things settled. Her voice was sweet, careful. I didn't ask many questions, because when your child asks for help, you don't interrogate. You open the door. When she arrived, suitcase in hand, she hugged me quickly. Too quickly. She looked around the house with a strange expression. Not curiosity, assessment. I ignored it. That night I made dinner. She ate without thanking me. She checked her phone while I spoke. Small things, easy to excuse, but something in the air had shifted, and I didn't know yet that the morning she woke me before sunrise wasn't the beginning of the end. It was the moment I finally saw it. That first evening, I told myself I was imagining things. People arrive tired. People arrive stressed. People don't always remember their manners when they're worried about their own lives. That's what I told myself as I set the table. She sat at the kitchen counter scrolling through her phone, barely looking up. When I placed the food down, she nodded once. No smile. No thank you. Just a quick glance, as if checking whether I'd done it correctly. We ate mostly in silence. I asked how work was going. She answered vaguely. I asked how long she thought she'd stay. She shrugged and said, "We'll see." That should have unsettled me more than it did. After dinner, she didn't help clear the dishes. She stood up, stretched, and walked through the living room, opening cupboards and drawers as if she were already familiar with where everything should be. She frowned at the shelves. "You still keep things like this?" she said. It wasn't a question. I smiled lightly, the way you do when you don't want a conversation to turn sharp. "I suppose I do," I said. She sighed. That sound stayed with me. Later that night, just as I was preparing to go to bed, she stopped me in the hallway. "I need to wake up early tomorrow," she said. "Oh," I replied. "What time?" She looked at me the way someone looks at a timetable, not a person. 5, she said. "I'll need breakfast ready." I laughed softly because I genuinely thought she was joking. 5, I repeated. "That's earlier than the birds." She didn't laugh back. She tilted her head slightly and said, "Yes, I function better in the mornings, and I don't like rushing." There it was. Not a request, not even an expectation disguised as politeness. A declaration. I hesitated, just a second too too long, she noticed. As the host, she added, that's your responsibility. The words landed strangely. Host, not mother, not family. Host. I felt a flicker of something then, not anger but confusion, as if I'd stepped into a conversation already in progress without knowing the rules. I told myself not to overthink it. All right, I said. I'll see what I can do. She nodded once, satisfied, and went to her room. I stood there for a moment, staring at the closed door, trying to work out when exactly the ground had shifted beneath my feet. That night, sleep came slowly. I lay awake listening to the house settle, every familiar sound suddenly feeling different. I thought about the word she'd used, responsibility. I thought about how easily it had come to her. At some point, I set my alarm. 4 o'clock, earlier than I'd woken in years. When the alarm went off, it startled me. The room was still dark, heavy with night. I sat up slowly, joints stiff, heart racing slightly from the sudden noise. For a moment, I considered turning it off and going back to sleep. Just for a moment, but then I pictured her face. Calm, certain, already decided. So I got up. I moved quietly through the kitchen, boiling water, laying out plates, trying not to wake her. The clock on the wall ticked loudly in the silence. As I worked, a strange thought crept in. When did I start needing permission in my own home? Pushed it away. This was temporary, I told myself. She was under stress. Things would settle. When everything was ready, I sat down at the table and waited. 5 o'clock came, then 5 passed, then 10. Finally, she appeared, hair perfectly brushed, clothes pressed, as if she'd been awake long before me. She looked at the table, then at me. This will do, she said. Not thank you, not good morning, just that. She ate quickly, checking her phone between bites. I watched her from across the table, feeling something twist slowly in my chest. This wasn't about breakfast. This was about something else entirely. Something unspoken, something heavier. When she finished, she stood up, grabbed her bag and said, I'll be back later. Try to keep things tidy. Then she left. The door closed softly behind her. I remained seated, staring at the empty plate, the untouched cup of tea growing cold beside me. That was the moment I understood something important. This wasn't a visit. It was a test, and I had just failed it by complying. The days that followed moved quietly, but nothing felt peaceful. She didn't shout. She didn't argue. She didn't openly insult me. Instead, she adjusted things. She reorganized the kitchen cupboards while I was in the garden, lining things up the way she preferred. When I came back inside and reached for a mug, it wasn't where it had been for years. Oh, she said casually, noticing my pause. This makes more sense. I nodded, not because I agreed, but because I wasn't ready to disagree. She commented on the house constantly, but never directly. It's charming, she'd say, looking around. Or, you've kept it exactly the same. The way she said it made both sound like criticisms. She began setting her own routines. She chose when meals should happen. She decided which rooms needed freshening up. She spoke about my habits as if they were obstacles that needed correcting. One afternoon, she sat across from me with a notebook open on the table. I've been thinking, she said, tapping her pen. This place could be so much easier to manage. I looked at her, unsure what she meant. For who? I asked. She smiled thinly. For you, of course. There it was again. That tone. Concern wrapped around authority. She talked about safety, about convenience, about how people our age shouldn't be burdened with upkeep. She spoke as if I weren't sitting right there. I reminded her gently that I was managing just fine. She waved her hand dismissively. I know you think you are. That sentence stayed with me longer than I wanted to admit. At night, I began locking my bedroom door. Not out of fear, out of instinct. I noticed she spent time on the phone in hushed voices, stepping outside or lowering her tone when I entered the room. Once I heard my name. Another time, I heard the word documents. When I asked her who she'd been talking to, she smiled too quickly and said, just sorting things out. Sorting what out? She began referring to the house as if it were temporary. This old place. When we change things. Once everything's settled. I corrected her once. This is my home, I said. She paused. Then she smiled again, that same polite, distant smile. For now, she replied. That was the moment a cold understanding began to form. I wasn't hosting a guest. I was being managed, measured, prepared. That night, I lay awake listening to her move around the house, opening drawers, checking cupboards, walking as if she had already memorized the floor. I thought about the morning she woke me before sunrise, about the 5 words, about how calmly she'd spoken them, and I finally understood understood something I'd been avoiding. Those words hadn't been said in anger. They had been said with certainty, because decisions had already been made, without me. The next morning, I woke before the alarm. It had become a habit, one I didn't ask for, one I didn't want, but my body had learned it anyway. I moved quietly through the kitchen. The house was still dark. I prepared tea, laid out breakfast quietly. I tried to make it perfect, not for her, not for anyone, but because I felt trapped in an invisible game I hadn't agreed to play. She arrived moments later, perfectly composed. She looked at the table, then at me, and nodded as if grading my work. "This will do," she said. I wanted to say, "This is my home, not yours," but the words stuck in my throat. That was the first real lesson I learned about her. Power doesn't always announce itself with noise. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it simply expects. Over the next few days, the requests grew. Not huge things. Small, deliberate nudges. Move this. Do that earlier. Answer that question in a certain way. She was meticulous. Every action, every glance, carefully measured. I started noticing patterns in her behavior. The way she lingered near the living room window, checking if I was awake. The soft tapping on my phone when I tried to make a call. Her casual remarks about the future of the house. Everything she said, every instruction, every gentle suggestion, carried an unspoken weight. And then came the moment I realized it wasn't just about control. It was about breaking me into compliance. That's when I stopped pretending I didn't notice. I observed quietly. I listened intently. I watched every movement and every word, because power once recognized can be countered. It doesn't always take shouting or confrontation. Sometimes it takes patience. And I was patient, even when my hands shook while pouring the tea, even when I wanted to cry and slam doors, even when the 5 words from that first sunrise echoed in my mind. I didn't respond with anger. I didn't beg for respect. I waited, because every empire of control has cracks, and I was learning where hers were. It was a rainy afternoon when I noticed it, the first real crack in her carefully constructed control. She had been talking on the phone, whispering just a little too loudly, her back to me. I pretended not to listen, as I often did, but a single phrase made me pause. "Everything is set. She won't notice." Her voice trembled slightly, a hint of impatience creeping in, though she quickly corrected it with a laugh that didn't reach her eyes. I walked past the doorway slowly, casually, pretending to stretch, yet listening carefully. "Set what?" I asked softly. She startled and quickly hung up. "Nothing," she said, forcing a smile. I nodded, pretending to accept it, but inside I knew I had been given a glimpse, a mistake. That was all I needed. Her first misstep was subtle, almost unnoticeable, but it revealed her overconfidence. She thought I was too exhausted, too compliant, too trusting to notice. I wasn't, and from that moment, I began to observe every move, every conversation, every glance with more precision than ever before. I didn't confront her. Not yet. I waited. Patience was my strategy. She didn't realize it, but every small detail she shared, every slight miscalculation, was a seed of my quiet resistance. I made notes in my mind, little patterns, habits, schedules, words she repeated, and the strangest part, the more I paid attention, the less fearful I felt. Her control was only as strong as my willingness to believe in it. By the end of the week, I had mapped her routines. I knew when she woke, what she ate, how she moved around the house. I could anticipate her steps before she took them, and with that knowledge came a new power. Not loud, not aggressive, but steady, quiet, inevitable. I realized then that she had underestimated me completely, and that mistake would cost her more than she could imagine. The next morning, I woke earlier than usual, long before the alarm, long before she even stirred. I moved silently through the kitchen, each step careful, deliberate. I had no plan to shout, no intention of confrontation. This was not about anger. It was about awareness. I remembered her words from the first sunrise, her calm certainty, her quiet command, the 5 words that had ended our relationship. I poured the tea slowly, laid out breakfast with care, but my mind was racing. I observed her movements through the doorway, noting the way she glanced at the table, the angle of her shoulders, the way her eyes scanned the room. It struck me how easy it had been for her to assume power, how she had never stopped to consider the person she was dealing with. I decided then that subtlety would be my ally, not confrontation but strategy, not anger but precision. Over the next few days, I orchestrated tiny, almost imperceptible shifts, a misplaced cup here, a slight adjustment in the arrangement of the table there, small details that didn't scream defiance but suggested oversight. I watched her reactions closely. She noticed, of course. Small, almost invisible glances betrayed her irritation, but she dismissed it. She thought I was distracted, forgetful, and that was her second mistake. Her overconfidence allowed me the space to act without fear. It wasn't about hurting her physically or embarrassing her. It was about reclaiming dignity, certainty, about showing her that control was never absolute. The tension in the house grew, not openly, not violently, but quietly, almost imperceptibly. She began speaking more sharply, more insistently, as if trying to reassert her dominance, and I remained calm, because now I was no longer playing her game blindly. I was creating the rules for my own. By the evening, I had planned carefully how I would test her next, how I would demonstrate that the household, my life, was not hers to command. The first act of subtle resistance was coming, and I waited for the perfect moment. The morning arrived just like any other, except this time, I was awake long before her. The house was silent, the kind of silence that carries anticipation. I moved through the room slowly, observing, listening, calculating. Every step was measured. She came down the stairs at exactly 5 o'clock. Perfect timing, perfect posture, calm, certain, confident. She looked at the breakfast table, and I met her gaze. For the first time, I did not lower mine. "This will do," she said. I nodded politely. Then I did something I had never done before. I added a little twist, a single adjustment in the placement of the sugar, the positioning of the teacups, the arrangement of her favorite morning plate. Nothing that would cause a disaster, nothing that would be obvious, but enough to make her pause. She noticed. I could see it in the slight hesitation, the micro-expression that lasted just a fraction of a second. She blinked, a small frown appearing, quickly suppressed. I poured her tea carefully and placed it in front of her. She lifted her cup, took a small sip, and froze. The taste was slightly off. Not bad, not ruined, but different enough to make her wonder. She looked at me, expecting a flustered response. There was none. I smiled softly, calmly, neutral. Her confidence wavered. I could see it. The quiet realization that she wasn't in total control, that she couldn't predict every move, that she had underestimated the person she thought she could dominate. She swallowed, set the cup down, and continued eating in silence, her mind racing. And I understood something crucial in that moment. Control is often assumed, but it must be maintained. And once broken, even slightly, it begins to crumble. From that morning, our dynamic shifted. No words were exchanged about the past, about the 5 words, about her assumption of dominance. Everything was silent. Everything was strategic. I had begun to reclaim my space, my home, my life. And with each passing hour, each carefully observed action, I regained what she had tried to take. By evening, I had quietly mapped her habits, her subtle manipulations, her reliance on my compliance. She thought she was teaching me a lesson. In truth, I was teaching her one. The following days carried the same rhythm. She moved through the house like it belonged to her. She rearranged cupboards, commented on habits, and tried to reassert control. But I had changed. I no longer reacted emotionally. I no longer complied blindly. I observed. I listened. I waited. And then it happened, her second mistake. It was an ordinary morning. She had left her phone on the counter while fetching her tea. A small oversight, almost invisible, but the screen lit up with a message she didn't mean for me to see. I noticed it instantly. "Everything is ready. She hasn't noticed a thing. Proceed tonight." I froze. Those words were small, but they carried weight. I had been aware of the shifting dynamics for days, but now the picture was clear. Her calm certainty was cracking. Her overconfidence had exposed intentions that had remained hidden until that moment. I didn't confront her. I didn't speak. I only watched. Her mistake allowed me to understand her plan, her motives, her manipulations. And for the first time since that morning she woke me with 5 words. I felt something I hadn't felt in weeks. Control. Not loud, not aggressive, quiet, precise control. The house felt different. The air shifted. She no longer moved with the same confidence. I could sense hesitation in her steps, doubt in her glance, uncertainty in the tone of her voice. And it was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was enough. It was the beginning of the reversal. The power had not yet fully shifted, but the first seeds of change had been sown. And I knew deep down that once you see the cracks in someone's armor, you can't ignore them. The following morning, the house was quieter than it had been in weeks. She moved through the rooms carefully, checking cupboards, straightening the cushions, setting out her tea, but her steps lacked certainty. That calm, commanding presence from the first sunrise was gone. I watched her from the kitchen doorway, calm, composed, and aware. I poured myself a cup of tea and took a slow sip, letting the warmth settle in my hands, letting the silence speak for me. I didn't confront her. I didn't demand apologies or explanations. Some lessons are taught silently. Some victories are claimed quietly. She left the house later that afternoon, suitcase in hand, without a word about her plans. And I realized something that no argument could have ever taught me. Respect cannot be demanded. It cannot be forced through control or intimidation. It is earned, quietly, consistently, with dignity and self-awareness. The 5 words she spoke that morning had ended our relationship in one way, but they also revealed something important. important. Not every battle is about confrontation. Not every fight is loud. Sometimes the strongest response is calm, measured, and strategic. Sometimes letting the consequences of one's own actions unfold is the most powerful lesson of all. I forgave her not because she apologized, but because I forgave myself for believing that love alone was enough to sustain a relationship without mutual respect. I rebuilt my mornings, my routines, my peace, and in that rebuilding, I found something I had long forgotten: my own strength. Some mornings don't just begin a day, they end illusions, and through endings we find beginnings. Respect, dignity, and quiet strength. These are the foundations of relationships that truly endure. Not control, not power, not fleeting words, but understanding, patience, awareness, and knowing when to walk away with your head held high.